Well, friends, welcome to the Connecting the Dots webinar series, examining militarism from a variety of intersectional perspectives through the lens of Christian faith. My name is Carl Horton. I am the coordinator of the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program, and I will serve as moderator for today's webinar. As we begin our time together, let us begin with prayer, led today by Shannon Vance Ocampo, co-chair of the Presbyterian Mission Agency Board. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you, Carl. Let us pray. Lord of love, we give thanks to you for gathering us together. For you are a God of love, of peace, of justice, truth, and freedom. You offer us pathways to true faithfulness, where we can let go of the things that attempt to lure or trap us, lull us into a false sense of security. Our true security is only in you. We lament on this day that we live in a world that is oftentimes not ordered in your way, does not conform to the teachings of Jesus, Prince of Peace, the one who proclaimed that he had come to bring good news to all of creation, the one who told us to put down our swords, the one who bravely proclaimed the truth of peace, even in his time of militaristic violence. We feel trapped, oh God, even though we are not. We have become numb to the lie that there is no other way. Economies of extraction protected by the economies of war, where lives, ecosystems, communities, countries, animals, plants, lands, and bodies of water are seen by the false gods of capitalism as only things, something that is easy picking, something that is to be used, something that is to be stripped down. We are taught that everything is transactional, everything has a price, that we can take and take and take, and there will be no consequences, that we are here to dominate rather than to keep and till, that the world is divided into friends and enemies, and that war-making violence, the economies of militarism, are the only ways to be prosperous and free. These lies of these false gods whisper in our ears and have taken up residence in our souls, even in the life of your church. And yet, oh God, you teach us a different way, a way of expansiveness, a way of giving, of sharing, redistribution, a way of the economies of peace and well-being. Your way, the way of Jesus, is always countercultural. It has always been this way. We need to get back to the essence of being your church. We need to get back to being true followers of Jesus. And so as we take out time today to listen and to learn from teachers and friends, co-laborers in your beloved communities, may we find ourselves turning back to your way, remembering your teachings, renewing our faith. Let us in this time move towards a restoration of discipleship. Today, grow in us your way of nonviolence to all living things, past, present, and future. Remind us of the sacredness that is in all living beings, for everything in creation is alive and beloved. Knit us back together in this time, piece by piece, reminding us of your life-giving pathways that heal and restore. May we listen, learn, and then go out to make all things new, filled by your Spirit, guided by the life of Jesus, our teacher, loved by you, O God of creation. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Shannon, very much for that prayer and great start to our conversation today. I want to remind folks that if you would like to take advantage of English to Spanish translation, interpretation, please use the interpretation icon in your toolbar, and we will be providing that for today's webinar. Today's webinar is the 7th in an ongoing series organized by the Peace USA's Militarism Working Group. Each episode in this series is being recorded and added to the Connecting the Dots webpage for future access. So you can View this webinar later and any of the previous ones as well. Previous episodes have provided a theological and biblical foundation for our understanding of militarism. We've heard from global partners about militarism, climate change, and community well-being. We've examined the connections that exist between militarism and gun violence in the US and violent conflict around the world. We've learned about moral injury and the impacts of military service, discussed the actions and policies of the Presbyterian Church USA related to militarism, and learned about the commitments of our peace churches to combat militarism in all its forms. So today, we look specifically at the intersection between militarism and the economy, and militarism's role in perpetuating poverty. Before I introduce our speakers, our team thought it would be helpful to review one definition of militarism. It comes from Reverend Deborah Lee, who in our first webinar provided definitions for us for both militarism and genuine security. The definitions that she gave us come from the International Women's Network Against Militarism and can be found in their March 2021 statement entitled "A Feminist Vision for Genuine Security and Creating a Culture of Life." Here is how they define militarism. We define militarism as a system of beliefs, political priorities, and economic investments. Militarism includes the activities of corporations that produce and sell weapons, the role of state militaries, including state-sanctioned violence, martial law, repression, extrajudicial killings, military coups, and military dominance within governments, as well as non-state militias. Militarism is shored up by patriarchy and reinforces violent masculinity. Military sexual violence is a manifestation of this synergy between militarism and patriarchy. And in that webinar, she drew a distinct contrast for us between military security and what she called genuine security. And here's how they define that. Genuine security requires the following guarantees: that the environment can sustain life, that people's basic needs are met, that human dignity is respected, that people's sovereignty is assured, and that society is organized so as to prevent avoidable harms. So we are very fortunate today to have two people with us to help us better understand the relationship between militarism and the economy, and specifically to help us understand how militarism perpetuates poverty. The Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis is director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, with the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. She is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Reverend Dr. Theoharis is the editor of We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign. She is the author of Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor, and co-author of Revive Us Again, Vision and Action in Moral Organizing. Reverend Dr. Theoharis has been organizing among poor and low-income communities for 30 years with organizations such as the National Union of the Homeless, the National Welfare Rights Union, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Domestic Workers United, and many more. Raised in a family committed to social justice, civil liberties, and human rights, she has been involved in the movement her whole life. Her writings are widely published by national news and religious organizations, and she is the recipient of numerous awards for her work. Also joining us today is the Reverend Jimmy Hawkins. Jimmy has served as the director of the Presbyterian Church Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C. He is also the director that oversees our our Presbyterian ministry at the United Nations, the advocacy ministries of the PCUSA. Prior to this position, he served pastorates in Durham, North Carolina, and in Peaks Presbytery, Virginia. His experience includes serving as treasurer on the Church World Service Global Board, as a board member of the National Council of Churches, as a board trustee with Union Presbyterian Seminary. He is a tri-chair of the Washington Interreligious Staff Community and the heads of Washington offices. He has chaired several interfaith, ecumenical, and nonprofit boards. His community ministry includes being a leader for the Moral Monday movement since its onset in 2013. He has participated in 3 actions of civil disobedience, protesting actions of the North Carolina General Assembly. I think there's one more that he can protest today. He served as a member of the North Carolina NAACP Executive Committee and has been active in justice advocacy throughout his ministry. He is engaged with the Poor People's Campaign and participated in a direct action at the Supreme Court in 2017. So he has a record. He is the author of Unbroken and Unbound, A History of Black Protest in America. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for being here today. Let me explain our format, and then I'm going to give it over to our guests. Our format will provide about 10 to 12 minutes for each speaker to present to us. We'll then have some moderated questions and conversation with the presenters, followed by a time for questions from those attending today's webinar in real time, and then we'll conclude with final remarks. If you are attending today, we invite you to post your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll gather them together. Use the Q&A tab or maybe the chat tab, and we'll be checking those to see what questions emerge as we hear from our presenters. So I think, if it's okay, we'll start with Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. Liz.
Well, thanks so much, Carl, and to the Militarism Working Group and to everyone for being here. It's really an honor. As was said in my bio, I was raised by a family that was very active in the peace and justice movement. I was the youngest daughter to a mom who committed years of her life to Presbyterian peacemaking. And so it feels really appropriate to be with everyone today. That same family followed the words of Reverend Dr. King, who said that peace is not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And from a young age, I was inspired by this Bible quote from the prophet Jeremiah: "My people are broken, shattered, and yet they put on Band-Aids saying, 'It's not so bad, you'll be just fine.' But things are not just fine. They say, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." So I was excited today to see the quote from Dr. King that's helping to guide our session. "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than our programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." Because I think you see, Reverend Dr. King saw clearly that a foreign policy defined by racism and poverty and militarism hurt poor and dispossessed people across the planet, at the same time as draining the United States of its moral vitality and other resources needed to fight poverty and injustice at home and across the world. So if we fast forward to today, we know that every dollar spent on feeding this war machine is a dollar not spent on housing, on healthcare, on education, on living wage jobs, on preventing future pandemics, on confronting the climate crisis. In fact, in the US, our endless wars and the 800 military bases across the world cost hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars, and they don't make our world any safer. But if we cut just $350 billion a year from the Pentagon budget, and we spent it on real security at home, just like was being defined just in that opening by Carl, we'd still have a larger military budget than China and Russia and Iran and many other countries combined. But in this country right now, a country that's beset by searing poverty and gaping inequality, widespread environmental injustice, and we see this overblown Pentagon budget, not just as a case of mismatched priorities, but actually, in fact, in the words of Dr. King, it's a war on the poor. This kind of violence first approach to foreign policy and domestic policy, it doesn't address the root causes of conflict or unrest. It doesn't make people in the United States any safer, and it certainly doesn't make people across the rest of the world safer. And so we have to ask this question, I think, at the outset of a conversation on militarism and its connections to poverty and racism, is who does it all serve? As folks maybe know, nearly half of the money that comes out of Pentagon's kind of overstuffed coffers goes straight to for-profit war corporations. Corporations like Lockheed Martin, whose multi-million-dollar kind of lobbying spending is only matched by excessive salaries of their top executives. And this is at the same time as we have 87 million people who are uninsured and underinsured. We have 62 million workers that are making less than a living wage. We have 15 million families that can't afford water, and 4 million whose water is poisoned. We have upwards of about 10 million people who are unhoused. And although the US doesn't have a military draft, we have a poverty draft where many young people who have really have no potential of getting an education or stable employment without being able to join the military. We have thousands of communities that are contaminated by petrochemical companies, industrial waste, and raw sewage. And that's all being made worse by climate change and the kind of militarization and destruction of the earth. And then we connect it to the question of kind of the modern policing system, and that being used to suppress Black and Brown and poor communities in order to kind of protect the private property of the rich and preserve the existing hierarchy of power. And we can see a similar kind of parallel with the way that the war economy is playing itself out in our world today. So then if we kind of go back to this biblical truth, where it says, where your treasure is, there shall your heart be. And we see that, again, this 53% of every federal discretionary dollar is going to the Pentagon, but less than 15%, less than 15 cents on the dollar to healthcare and childcare programs and other programs of social uplift combined. It must raise to us this question of what does our nation treasure? We have trillions of dollars being squandered in this country's never-ending war on terror at the same time as we have, before the pandemic, 140 million people who are poor and low income. And this is kind of where I want us to keep on making these connections and maybe actually continue to challenge folks. Poverty and the war economy, poverty and militarism are not only connected when defining kind of, as Dr. King talked about, these tripartite problems of racism, of materialism, and of militarism. But I want to also suggest that where kind of poverty and the war economy come together is also the weak point of these evils and how we're going to be able to strategically strike a nonviolent blow against them. So that last crusade that Dr. King was on was called the Poor People's Campaign. And it was at the same time that he came out talking about the connection between racism and poverty and militarism, that he also came out against the Vietnam War. But he didn't talk about his stance against the Vietnam War and his stance in favor of the Poor People's Campaign, like as a parallel kind of track. What he said was that uniting and organizing poor people into a new and unsettling force to disrupt the complacency of U.S. life, because the U.S. was, as he called, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, was then Dr. King's solution to this problem of militarism and violence and oppression. Often in our world today, we kind of separate these positions. Peace activists are quoting his anti-war positions. They read that very powerful sermon from exactly 1 year before Dr. King is assassinated, that he makes from the Riverside Church in New York City. It's on April 4th. It's called Beyond Vietnam. Um, and he comes out very forcefully, making these connections between racism and poverty and militarism. But often peace activists will quote just the anti-war positions, and civil rights groups will hold up his quotes and positions on voting rights and racial discrimination. And then labor folks and other economic justice leaders will talk about how Dr. King was concerned about poverty and wages. And then sometimes we'll even, quote all of these positions at once. But then many of us then go right back to our organizations and our silos and our solutions. I think to understand the indivisibility of King's critique of all these forms of injustice and inequality, to live into the challenge of his Beyond Vietnam sermon, to see, what this last crusade of his life was, we have to see that his foreign policy and domestic policy positions were united, and they centered around the power and potential of poor people and moral leaders in the United States uniting with poor people and moral leaders across the world. And so then, fast forward to today again, we're living in a moment when the world is on the brink of nuclear war. We're living at a time where there's a deepening poverty and a rising cost of living. When we then look at that US budget that now has, more than $1 trillion going to the Pentagon and war, but not to education, not to healthcare. We're seeing other cuts against programs, whether it's SNAP, whether it's the non-extension of the child tax credit. I really believe that Dr. King can be a important guide for us to see these connections between militarism and poverty. And that his prescription to unmatch military spending through the unity and kind of organizing of poor people as a strategy to win and build power. And so, I want to use one more quote from Dr. King, in these remarks that he talked about. He said, power, power for poor people, power for people who are hurting, will really mean having the ability, the togetherness, the assertiveness, and the aggressiveness to make the power structure of this nation say yes when they may be desirous to say no. So I don't know about y'all, but I'm kind of tired of hearing so many no's. No, we can't expand the child tax credit. No, we can't protect voting rights. No, we can't save the earth. No, we can't raise wages. No, we, can't stop cutting education budgets. No, we can't study and fund no war, no more. And so, if we're going to realize King's legacy, it means that we have to build a broad and deep enough movement that compels those in power and kind of non-violently forces them in power to even sometimes go against the will of those in power, but then to cancel debt and to enact fair taxation, to demilitarize our world, and to put people first and put the earth first. After all, if the United States shrank our war economy, eliminated nuclear weapons, and cut, U.S. military bases across the world, if we had a fair taxation system, if we canceled debts and we invested in universal health care and living wages and a guaranteed income, if we had decent, affordable housing and strong programs of social uplift where we kind of lift from the bottom so that everybody can rise, we could actually end poverty. We could do it. We have the resources, we have the programs, and the money is there to do it. So it's not that it can't be done. It's the how do we turn this no that we're so used to getting into a yes. And so I just think if we're trying to avert the spiritual death that Dr. King warns us about, we need to build a movement from the bottom up that can reconstruct this nation. And we have to build the kind of compelling power to make those in power agree to demands for peace and truth and love and freedom. And and we have to build a society where we lift from the bottom so everyone rises and everybody is in and nobody's out. And so therefore, if we're concerned about militarism and we're concerned about issues of war, we must be concerned around issues of systemic racism. We must be concerned about uniting and organizing poor and low income people. We must be trying to save the earth and everything living in and around it. And we must be pushing back against this false narrative of white Christian nationalism and other kind of heretical religion that tries to pit us against each other and sell us a bill of lies, but instead seeing the power and agency of those that are most impacted by our military economy, by racism, by poverty, banding together with people from all walks of life, and especially with people of faith as moral standard bearers in that work, so that we can, as we talk about in the Poor People's Campaign and at the Cairo Center, so we can move forward together and not one step back. So I look forward to us, talking about this more, but I think what we have to do here, what I'm trying to set the stage around is seeing the connections between these injustices and also holding out the hope that it does not have to be this way, that we can actually make change for the better, and that it's going to require people of faith and folks that are most impacted by militarism in the forefront of a movement for change. So thanks so much.
Wow, thank you, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris. We'll get back to you in just a minute. Let's hear from Reverend Jimmy Hawkins, and then begin. I'm seeing some questions being posed in the QA tab, but go ahead and continue to post those of you who are participating today, and we'll get to those later. Jimmy, it's all yours now.
Thank you, Carl. And I really want to thank my friend, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris. Carl, the only part of my introduction, which was way too long, that you did not read, was that the last time that I got arrested with the Poor People's Campaign, Liz and I got arrested together on the steps of the Supreme Court. And she would tell you, all we were doing was praying for justice and praying for an end to, injustice around this world. And so it's an honor to be here today on this topic to talk about militarism and its economic impact. As we look at definition of militarism, a pretty commonplace one, it's the belief of a government or a people that a state should maintain a strong military capacity, and not only to maintain it, but to use it aggressively to expand national interests globally and in its own country. And it produces values that support the use not only of force, but the Powell Doctrine came into being during the 1980s and 90s. And the Powell Doctrine was that when you use military force, was to use overwhelming force. And that drives much of our understanding of our military ideology today, that we not only have to have a strong military, but the strongest possible military. And so therefore you see all of this high discretionary spending on military that is justified in the minds of so many politicians and Americans, that we need to have military systems that not only are offensive, but also defensive. And so we see that one of the issues is that, and I'm going to talk, I really appreciate Liz's presentation, because she talked a lot about the facts of how much money is being spent and the impact it's having economically. And it also is having a cultural and a spiritual impact as well, because you can see that in this country, we are the most militaristic country I can imagine around the world. I mean, it not only from our politicians, but also from clergy, also from individuals out on the streets. We drink it up, and it's a part of who we are. And you can listen to how we talk about the military, and how we promote a professional military class, and how we really focus on the predominance of the armed forces and the administration of policy or state. And yet we call the military an honorable level of service. And everywhere you go into the movie theaters, you eat food on the airplanes. If you are a military veteran or a member of the armed forces, you get special privileges. And we say that they serve with honor. Now, not to denigrate those who serve, but what it does is that it causes a denigration of other areas of service. It glorifies the military while offering little support or acknowledging the honor of serving in non-military professions, such as teachers. Is there any other profession in this country that's more downbeat than teachers, or browbeaten than teachers? It even downplays clergy and nurses and social workers, hospitality laborers, farm workers, and others in service industries. And it is a hallmark of U.S. policy at home and abroad. And many of us take its impact for granted because it's so interwoven into the fabric of this culture and society that is oftentimes invisible. Militaristic policies are meant to maintain a strong, organized capacity for violence, and it aggressively defends or promotes in the defense or promotion of our national defense. And from war to mass incarceration, these policies fuel the pervasive problems of systemic racism, poverty, and ecological devastation. We know for a fact that there is a relationship between violence and a militaristic culture. As a matter of fact, the United States is the most dangerous nation in the developed world. Violence is immersed into every aspect of our society and has become accepted. It's immersed in the games our children play. I grew up in a culture wherein the first toy that you got as a boy was a gun. And we play cowboys and Indians, and we won't even get into all of the wrongness of that whole concept. But even today, the movies that we watch, from Top Gun to Avatar, even especially the Marvel movies that are directed towards our children, it teaches that problems are solved by fighting it out. We say in this culture, we live to fight the good fight or live to fight another day. Our most popular sports are those with physical contact, football and wrestling, and even ultimate fighting, where there are no boundaries to what you can do to another human being, and yet it's perceived as a form of entertainment. Our athletes, when you hear them talk, they equate playing children's games, football, basketball, baseball, with being on a battlefield. They call themselves warriors, brothers in arms. San Francisco's NBA team is called the Warriors, and until recently, Washington's team was the Bullets. And even to the church sings "Onward Christian Soldiers, marching on to war." And the right to own a gun in this country is seen not only as a political right, but as a God-given right. The Constitution is revered above the scripture and above Bible. And we don't even, as Americans, realize the implications of the positions that we take and how immersed we are in militarism. But just some of the implications of it. A young man is shot for ringing the doorbell, shot in the head. A young woman for turning into a driveway with two friends. Two young women for getting into a car mistakenly. A 6-year-old and a father are both shot because their basketball rolled into their neighbor's yard. And so we see that the implications are everywhere, and we are becoming numb to the violence that is happening. We know that there are already over 200 mass shootings in this country. So we must be sensitive to the different forms of violence and the ways that militarism impacts us emotionally, psychologically, and yes, even spiritually. And we must address violence in all of its manifestations and recognize that there's a connection between militarism, between violence, and the sins of racism, misogyny, homophobia, ageism, xenophobia, transphobia, that all of these are forms of violence, which are the implications of militarism. So the US government is the world's largest arms dealer. And so we oftentimes focus on the impact that it has on this nation, but our militarism impacts the entire world. You look at the war in Yemen, we still are the major supplier of arms to Saudi Arabia in this proxy war. And even with the Biden administration, we have got to challenge the Biden administration, because oftentimes we put a separation between Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, assuming that Democratic administrations are going to be less militaristic, but the Biden administration, and even in many ways the Obama administration, were very militaristic. But Biden's response to Ukraine is primarily a militaristic one. He wants to send them as many weapons as possible. He's encouraging Europe to send weapons, but pushing diplomacy and trying to sit down with the Russian government, trying to sit and bring them together, has really not been a part of the policy of this administration. Again, the U.S. is the world's largest arms dealer. According to Forbes, between 2017 and 2021, the U.S. accounted for 39% of the arms sales around the world, over twice that of what Russia did, and 10 times of what China did. We know that the European nations follow the U.S., France and Great Britain and Russia and even China, which is not a part of Europe, but they all are exporting arms around the world. And part of this whole concept is not only are they exporting assault weapons, automatic rifles, but they also are now there's a new trend in the arms industry wherein guns are being made so that children can fire them. And that's intentionality on their part. And so we see that we tie it with the economy because, again, we are supportive of our companies that are exporting violence around the world and not as supportive of industries that do not. And one of the things that I've been dealing with here in Washington, D.C., is that we have a 2005, it's called the Gun Commerce Protection Bill. And basically what happened was that in 2005, Congress passed a law that said that no American citizen can sue a gun company for the lawful use of its product. So therefore, if an AR-15 is used to kill 50 people, 26 children in Uvalde, or kill dozens of children in Sandy Hook, so the parents have no relief as far as going to the gun companies and said, you have produced a weapon that is responsible for these deaths. So we have got to work. One of my aims, wherever I talk about militarism and violence, is for the repeal of this bill. Now, Adam Schiff has a bill that has not gotten out of committee yet that would repeal this bill, but we have got to put a lot of energy because, again, this whole culture that we have, that is a pro-gun culture, this culture that we have that says that it's okay to kill certain people. And we see that, as Malcolm X said, that the chickens are coming home to roost with a higher amount of violence. And lastly, I want to talk about how militarism has impacted policing in this country. Now, as a person of color, the Black community in particular, but the Hispanic community and the Asian community have for centuries been saying that there's a problem in the ways in which policing is done in the United States. There's implicit bias against people of color. Violence is inflicted against people of color more so than white citizens. But this militarization of policing has taken it to a whole nother level, where in the military is now, it has so much money to spend that it has an overabundance of weapons. And so we know what's going on. And we see it on the streets of Ferguson and other streets where there's peaceful protests, but the police respond by bringing out all of their military gear. So what's happened is that law enforcement agencies have received 452,000 items worth $1 billion in surplus military equipment from the Department of Defense since 2017. And basically, we are now militarizing our police to respond to peaceful protests with force. And I think that's a major issue in this country because, we're seeing the pictures wherein the young woman was standing holding a flower and she put it in the rifle, the gun of the policeman who was standing in front of her. But the Americans look at this, and they're not bothered by this. And so again, one of the things I want to put forth is that we have been so impacted mentally by this militaristic buildup in this country, is that we no longer question the necessity of it. And as Liz has indicated, the fact that when we put all of this money into military spending, discretionary spending, it takes away from the programs that would feed children. It takes away from healthcare. It takes away from all of the programs that SNAP benefits. My last point is this. This is a relatively new endeavor in the history of this country. Up until the 1940s, for over 150 years in this country, the understanding was that we would only build up the military during times of war. After the war was over, every president pushed for the return of the military back to pre-war size. But after the 1940s and 50s, when the fear of communalism and the Cold War came into being, and all of a sudden we started, rather than decreasing after World War II, we decided we needed to build up, and that has really been the mindset ever since then. So our challenge is to one, to help Americans to know what our history when it comes to the ways in which we treat military buildup, and to go back to the understanding that we had pre-World War II, wherein only in times of conflict, and even not even then, do we need to have a very robust, strong military, but in peace times, we need to build up the areas of the community wherein there's the communities that are impoverished, wherein there's obvious problems dealing with policing and dealing with issues of race, gender, and sexual identity. So Cole, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Reverend Jimmy Hawkins. You both have given us a lot to think about, a lot of information. I'm a bit overwhelmed, maybe some of our listeners are as well. I want to start with Liz and just give you the chance to, was there anything that Jimmy said that you'd want to respond to, Liz? I know Jimmy heard you first, but when you listen to Jimmy, is there anything you'd want to lift up or add to that he said?
No, thanks for that opportunity, and thanks, Jimmy, indeed for sharing all that you share. I do want to just kind of maybe put emphasis on the way that militarism and the militarization of our communities is just like the air we breathe and the water we drink, and really appreciating, Jimmy pointing out how, throughout our culture, and our politics and our economics, we have that that orientation, and so I also think it is really important for us to draw the connections between questions around has been said, but between the kind of the daily experience of people of color and other marginalized groups in our society, and the way that militarism really plays a role in kind of every interaction that people have with our society. And I think, again, I think so often we otherwise kind of compartmentalize these different issues, and so again, think about militarism really only when we're talking about weapon systems, and yet actually I think it's really important to see how how, I mean, obviously militarized language, and cultural references, as well as just the presence of kind of the military and issues of militarism run throughout our society, and just help to hold it all together in the way that it is right now. So I just was really appreciating that.
Yeah, thank you. You both have really given us a lot of examples of how insidious militarism is. And I think we don't often see that. For some reason, it's camouflaged or disguised, or it's sort of crept into our daily lives. And one thing you said, Liz, was that was new, sort of a new idea to me, is the poverty draft. We don't have a draft, but there's a poverty draft. And we know that folks who are economically challenged and limited in their options will opt to serve in the military for economic reasons. That to me is a very tangible, or a very real way we can see how militarism and poverty intersect. I'm wondering, short of the understanding that our military budget is ginormous and we need to shrink our military budget and expand our social program budget. What are some other ways that you could help Presbyterians see how militarism and poverty intersect? These are intersectional. We know they're intersectional, but I think sometimes we don't see it. Are there other ways that you could, either of you, tell us more about how militarism really does impact the daily lives of people who are poor?
I'm happy to start, and I'm sure Jimmy has a lot more to add. There there's a myriad ways that these intersections happen. Uh, in addition to the poverty draft, there's the economic poverty that so many of the folks that are in the military actually suffer. Frontline folk in the military are still making so little money that their families, in many cases, qualify for federal assistance programs, whether it's SNAP, whether it's other welfare programs. And I think so often we don't actually recognize that and see that. 40% of single men who are unhoused are military veterans, and so there's a direct connection both to who goes into the military, but also when folks are still in the military or come out as veterans from war, they are still not really taken care of in society and honored the way that folks that have come forward to serve the country should be. And I think that that's really important for us to see. On the one hand, we're spending all of this money on militarization, and on the other hand, many of our frontline soldiers are not seeing those benefits at all, and in fact, find themselves really abandoned by the same society that they were willing to volunteer to serve. So I think that's important. I think also if we look at different kind of poor, especially urban communities across the country, there's a program called the 1033 program where they're basically bringing military equipment back to police office, to police for local policing. And it's a way for towns and cities that don't have a lot of money to kind of get used tanks and other military grade equipment. But it means that we're actually arming our population and our police departments in towns and cities across the country, and especially in poor communities. And so you have the same kind of equipment that is in Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen right now, coming back and actually being used to kind of police people in poor communities. And then I think, again, if we're going to draw out this idea of the poverty draft a little bit more, it means that Presbyterians should be out there who are concerned around inequities of all forms, advocating for higher wages, advocating for healthcare programs, advocating for education, because both veterans and folks that don't go into the military are want for higher paying jobs, for healthcare, for education opportunities, and so again, a country that has almost half of its people poor and low income, and one of the clearest routes from poverty is to join the military. And then when you join the military, many families are not escaping poverty still, and finding themselves in very difficult situations, is clearly a nation that needs folk advocating for programs and policies that impact everybody, but especially impact groups that are kind of more marginalized. And so, the, you know, and maybe one more, and then I'm going to throw it to Jimmy because there's a lot more to say. But I think it's also really important when we're talking about kind of the connection between the military kind of industrial complex and the economy, is that right now, you know, it costs our country about $1 trillion a year to have the level of child poverty that we have. And for every dollar invested in programs for kids to raise them out of poverty, we save as a nation $7 in the future. And it really goes very differently when you talk about investing in the military. For every kind of job, every dollar invested in the military, you get a lot less for that investment than if you invested in climate resilient jobs, if you invested in education and other social programs. And so actually, not only is the nation spending a lot of money on the military, but right now the kind of the gains that you make on every dollar invested are a lot less and are a lot less helpful to the economy as a whole than other kinds of investments in healthcare, in education, in addressing child poverty, in problems around the climate. And so I think it's also important for us to see that, you know, when taxpayers give $1 to the military, it produces a lot less jobs and a lot less economic kind of benefit to the benefit of the whole society than when we give $1 to education, or when we give $1 to healthcare, or when we give $1 to addressing climate change. Those are good investments. Investing in the military, in part because of for-profit military corporations, they don't redound to the benefit of the all. So, jump in there.
Okay. Thank you, Liz. Excellent summary. And I think that as people of faith, we have a unique contribution to add to the conversations about militarism that we oftentimes shy away from. We've got to talk about militarism and violence from a faith perspective. Oftentimes when we engage with these conversations about the Second Amendment right of the Constitution, we're going to lose those arguments, because you're not going to change people's minds who are made up that they have a right to bear arms, regardless of the word militia being included in that. But we've got to talk about, what does our faith say? And we've got to embrace being a pacifist. I think Christians have shied away from that. It's almost a bad word in American culture, that we are peacemakers. And even to our own detriment, that we're willing to make the sacrifices so that others might have life, that we might not have all the weapons that we might are being told that we need in order to be safe, that we are jeopardizing our freedom, but actually we're making ourselves more free and more safe, especially our children. So I think from the Christian perspective in particular, when we look at the example of Jesus is no question. He said, those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. And we've got to be more challenging. We've got to challenge this culture of violence in the United States and say, this is not a way for anyone to live. And so I think, again, talking about why we believe what we believe from a faith-based perspective is something that we have got to be very determined in, very intentional in, and to do that. Also, I think that we've got to hold this country and European nations accountable for the level of violence, which is indicative through the money that's being spent on weapons. The world needs a Marshall Plan that the U.S. and the European nations embarked upon after World War II, because not only is the United States a recipient of its own levels of violence, but also we're spreading violence around the world. And really, since colonialism, we have not really put in place a global plan to promote peace, to promote economies and struggling nations. You know, we just had the coronation of King Charles, and all of that gold and the Jamaican bishop asked the question, where do you think that gold came from? It came from developing nations that are developing because all of their wealth was basically taken out of their land. So this ties into this conversation because we've got to talk about how militarism is about power, it's about greed, it's about status, it's about forcing others to do what I tell you to do. And so therefore, when people say you need to respect me, you need to also share the wealth with those who have been robbed and had so much stolen from them. And so I do think we need a global Marshall Plan that the United States needs to take the lead and to invest in nations that have been impacted by colonialism and impacted by militarism, and especially those that are engaging in war. None of the automatic weapons that troops are using, for example, in the Sudan, those are imported weapons that are being used in this conflict right now. And again, as Liz said, that a disproportionate amount of the income from the sale of weapons around the world goes into these munition companies, but also that a disproportionate amount of the money that we distribute towards the military goes in the pockets of private contractors.
Yeah.
I mean, it's disproportionate. I think you mentioned almost half of that money goes in the pockets of private contractors. So we need some type of a Marshall Plan, but we also need to, when the question is asked on the federal level, well, how are we going to pay for these programs? We need to candidly and strongly say it needs to come from the discretionary budget of the military, the discretionary spending. We need to cut military spending, and we shy away from that. And even Democrats, Democrats are just as guilty as Republicans as increasing the military budget year after year. And so there's no party that can take the high road on this. And so oftentimes, again, I think that we shy away from having these difficult conversations. But the federal policy level for poverty level for a family of four is around $24,000 in this country. That's criminal. It's criminal. And we need to tell our politicians that they need to raise the federal policy level and to increase the spending. One of the things that we oftentimes have allowed to get ourselves to get away with in this country, that we, starting with Ronald Reagan, and he labeled primarily poor Black mothers as welfare queens and welfare cheats. But the reality is we know that more whites than people of color are on welfare. And also there's a perception that people who are on welfare can work. There's only like 9% of people who receive some type of federal benefits in this country that are of working age. Most of them are disabled, they're seniors, and they're children. And so we need to change the narrative about how the money is spent in this country to what we call entitlement programs, that it really is a minuscule investment, and therefore we get minuscule results. I would also say that, and I really appreciated what Liz said, we're not bashing the troops. No one here is bashing the troops, and no one is saying that we should not support our troops. But I am sick and tired of a nation that says that it supports the troops when on average, for over a decade now, 20 veterans kill themselves each day. And we do very little about that. And in families, when soldiers are deployed overseas, oftentimes, and there are stipulations that there's only so much support that family can receive as far as welfare benefits. Families have to, wives who are left behind have to get 1 or 2 jobs in order to support the family. So we've got to hold this country accountable and say, if you really support the troops, then one, explore what percentage of military spending goes towards the development of weapon systems, which is the vast majority of it. It does not go towards the troops. The troops got a minuscule raise under Biden, but it's still quite pitiful how much money they receive. So we've got to reevaluate this culture and we say, well, okay, we support troops, we're going to honor them, but it's all lip service. And so I do think that as we talk about the intersectionality between poverty and militarism, we've got to understand that the more we feed this monster, that the more the fewer resources that we're going to have to really help our children in our vulnerable parts of our population.
Yeah, as you might imagine, Liz and Jimmy, the phone lines are lighting up as far as Q&A. I want to share one comment that was posted while we were talking about what congregations can do. Mark Davidson wrote, in a time of such rampant violence and the sense that there are so few alternatives to the air we breathe. We need models of faith communities that breathe other air, are living differently, adopting different values, values of peace, anti-militarism, nonviolence. In times of hopelessness, we need models of our wholeness. And thank you, Mark, for that comment while we were talking about, what we can do. And I do want to get back to the what Liz, you mentioned was that we are supporting so much private corporate war machining. 50% of the Pentagon budget, you said, goes to private corporations. And somebody has asked, let me find it, that you mentioned Lockheed Martin. One person would like to know what are the other examples of for-profit military corporations. And then another person, when we talk about militarism and the economy, because it feels like we serve and worship our economy, the system of capitalism, one person asked, Marta Gutenberg wrote, let me find it here. Oh shoot, Marta, there it is the triumph of capitalism the reason why militarism is ascendant in the US? So in other words, as capitalism thrives as our economic system, does that then, are they like cause and effect? Capitalism grows, therefore militarism grows. I think she's wondering if capitalism is the cause of this huge, Jimmy, you talked about the overwhelming force, and somehow our military went into hyperspeed as far as the size and scope of what we need to be able to do, this power doctrine. So will you both or one of you speak to that?
Well, I'll start us out, and Liz really is the facts expert on this. But there's two sides of the same coin. And that's the other golden cow that we can't talk about. And even as Christians, we're very hesitant to criticize capitalism. Capitalism is not a perfect system. It exploits the labor of working people for the benefit of the few. And the goals are the same. Wherein you have, in a capitalistic system, and I really find it fascinating as we study the history of capitalism in this country as opposed to communism. We have socialist aspects of our federal government. There's just no question about this. The things that drives me crazy is that most of them benefit the wealthy. We have subsidy for R&D for pharmaceutical companies. These agro businesses, these agro farms get subsidies and things along that line. But it always becomes wherein there's this tension between capitalism and communism, wherein communism is viewed as bad and capitalism is good. Well, we've got to have a serious critique of capitalism and to realize that it is intertwined with militarism, because again, I would dare say that capitalism is the overall demon and that perhaps militarism is a subset of capitalism, because you see the similarities in that. The goal is for the benefit of those who can capitalize from the system. And what I'm trying to say is that in capitalism, I'm a Christian, and I believe that Jesus talked about wealth redistribution. When he said to the rich young ruler, take everything that you have, sell it, give the money to the poor, and then come and follow me. So we have a system that is sacrosanct in capitalism, wherein we don't want to critique its benefits and its failures. And so I do think there are two sides of the same coin, that the goals of both are really interrelated.
So I have a lot of different thoughts on a bunch of pieces. I wanted to kind of jump in around the what were some of the other companies that are for-profit kind of military contractors. And so I think a couple would be probably familiar to folks like Boeing, Raytheon, there's General Dynamics, there's like the Northrop Grumman, but then there's also, corporations that maybe are known for other things like Honeywell, right? But then are producing lots of uh, lots of equipment that is used in military, um, different situations. And so uh, I think it's actually really interesting and helpful for us to be a little more aware about these kind of multinational kind of military companies. Because again, and one thing I might encourage folks here uh, to do is to check out two different kind of websites. One is a program at Brown University in their kind of public affairs school that's called the Costs of War Project. There's just a lot of really good information if folks are interested in both understanding more of these kind of corporations, but also just the kind of who is profiting from war and where's money going and that kind of stuff. The other piece that I would suggest is to check out the National Priorities Project. They're now housed at the Institute for Policy Studies, and they have this kind of really cool thing on their website, which is called trade-offs. So for instance, if you're in a local community and you both want to have a sense of how much money is being spent in your community that is basically going to the military, you can find a bunch of that information here. But you can also, say, in my community, if they were to shift, $20,000 from the military, what would that pay for? Um, and it's one of the places where you can start seeing that, like, just one contract that the U.S. military has with a group like Lockheed Martin, could fund teachers in 50 states across the country, right? I mean, because we're talking at a level of military spending that I think a lot of times we can't fully comprehend. I mean, what is $1 trillion? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine what that is. And so I would just encourage folks, if you're interested in kind of exploring this more, I think it's really helpful also towards that kind of charge, just like to find the kind of communities that are doing it differently. I've seen folks really effectively use that National Priorities Project kind of trade-offs piece to be like, guess what? We could have healthcare for everybody in this community. And it wouldn't cost us much, and those kinds of things. So, and then I wanted to think for a second about, how intertwined. And again, I really find Dr. King's kind of three evils really helpful. As a part of how the whole society functions, of seeing the deep connections between racism and militarism. And, sometimes he calls materialism, sometimes he calls capitalism, sometimes he calls economic exploitation, sometimes he calls poverty. And I'm not sure he actually uses those interchangeably. I think he's meaning different things and each time he uses them, but to see how, any society that can other people, whether it's by race or religion or ethnicity or kind of economic status. I mean, I live in New York City right now, and there's a lot of othering of homeless people and unhoused people happening right now. Folks seen basically as less than human because they don't have a roof above their heads. But so he makes this point that kind of any society that can other people then can exploit those people, politically and economically, and then can use their military or police or whatever, kind of to enforce that, right? And so he talks about just like how all of these systems work together, that you have these ideas, but then those ideas kind of are fought out in the society, through our police and military function and through our political policies and economic policies, and how those kind of are enforced. And and whose benefit they go to. And so to me, that is really helpful. And so the question of is where do militarism and capitalism kind of connect? But also I saw another question, kind of where this question of kind of othering people connects. Is I think it's all very interrelated. And you know, we have it's very clear that you know, even in the conversation right now that's happening on a national level around guns, that both the Supreme Court and many of our state legislators are deciding to, you know, really lift up the gun lobby over deciding to, you know, legislate about assault weapons, and therefore, on some level, you know, despite the protracted violence, you know, more or less the gun lobby is winning out over the kind of lives of kids. And so I think you can see, again, in my mind, it's like, you know, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. Right now, it really looks like you know, our society's heart is with these corporations and these lobbyists, and not with the people. I don't think that's true of the vast majority of people in any way. I don't think, but I think that that's the walk and talk that our politicians and our kind of those that kind of have the wealth and power in our society are.
And Carl, if I could add one more sentence, because I don't think I was too clear at the beginning, because I do think militarism is promoted using economic language. Oftentimes we talk about, well, we are promoting job promotion and we're creating jobs and protecting jobs. And I think about there was a group of teenagers who went to protest outside of a munition company, and they basically were saying that they wanted them to stop selling automatic weapons and semi-automatic weapons globally and domestically. And in the article, it talked about one of the criticisms that they faced was that, well, you know, this company is providing jobs in the local community. And how do you take a stand in your own community against a company? But see, that's part of the justification for militarism, that there are no sacrifices that have to be made. There are a lot of other companies that can do job creation and promotion. You don't necessarily make guns in order to do that, but I think that militarism is oftentimes justified using economic language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A number of folks in the Q&A want to talk about our elected leaders. And both of you are certainly active with in Washington. I'm wondering, like, for instance, Roger Olson wrote to me personally prior to this in response to the webinar announcement. He wants to talk about sort of the debt ceiling negotiations going on right now and why it appears that neither Republicans or Democrats are even willing to consider reducing the huge portion of our budget that goes to the Pentagon. So that's I think what I'm going to read to you are a number of frustrations and also sort of conundrums. What do we do about this? Ukraine, you know, there's somebody posted about how difficult it is when we are providing the weaponry to Ukraine. It seems like a just cause, and so that is a positive use of military. So that I'm trying to find that one. It's problematic for that person. Another person talked about how do we drastically rebalance our investments in the military when short and medium term reality is that in times of mass crisis, the military is the most immediately available and impactful resource, whether it's the Coast Guard and National Guard responding to tornadoes, floods, and hurricanes, or the ability of the Air Force and Navy to rapidly respond to weather or medical disasters globally. So I think this difficulty in saying there are reasons to have a military, but we also, when we're in a wartime that feels like a just war, it actually accelerates sort of the production and the sort of justification of our war machine, and makes it seem like it's a good thing. So both the frustration with an unwillingness to adjust our Pentagon budget when we're facing this, however many trillion, like you, Liz, I can't even imagine what 1 trillion is, but our national debt keeps going up. So how would you all respond to just frustration with legislators and sort of the trying to rebalance the military budget? How would that ever happen?
Liz, I'm going to take the easy one. I'm going to do that one first. That's an easy one. It's a political non-starter. No politician wants to go to his constituents with a reputation that he cut the military budget, and they are really afraid of being painted as someone who is not supportive of the military, and that's across the board. You will not get any Democrats or any Republicans to take the lead in calling for a reduction of military spending in this country, and that's just a reality. I do think that we as people of faith have to challenge them in that and to let them know that we do want them to take such steps, and that it will not destroy their career, but I think it's all a political consideration as to why they won't do that. And Liz, you want to tackle the other one?
Well, I still have a little to say about this though, because I feel like the piece is that right now it is very difficult to have politicians coming out saying that they're gonna cut the military budget. I mean, Representative Barbara Lee, who was the only person that came out against the Iraq War early on, and has introduced into Congress multiple different pieces that are talking about kind of cutting the military budget. I mean, she can attest that that it's not a popular stance, and it's not one that many other Congress people are willing to make. But what she can also attest to, I think, and what we have seen in the work that the Poor People's Campaign has done, and Kairos and Repairs of the Breach, is that when we start to raise these questions about militarism and about military spending, and actually put it out there, and raise awareness also about how much money is being spent, and how that is then money that is not being spent on many of the things that the vast majority of people in this country really need and want. Again, living wages, healthcare that's better and universal and not so costly. What we have seen is that people move, and that our politicians move. We in 2019 had a budget committee hearing with the House of Representatives, and we marched into that hearing and had impacted folk, including a number of veterans and other military people that are a part of our kind of larger movement and coalition, and talked about what it would look like to adjust the military budget, enact a fairer taxation system, and invest in the kinds of things that are actually going to grow the economy and weather us for climate change. It had an impact. People were very moved, and in fact, the next time that Barbara Lee and others kind of introduced a bill talking about shifting some of our military funding towards other kinds of programs, a whole lot more congressional representatives were on board. And so I think that it's not that, and I think when we look at the history of change in this country, you can move from having politicians have taking positions that are not actually in line with where the vast majority of people are at, and you can move folk, and you can shift. I mean, again, if we look at the example of some of the Black freedom struggle work, before that, some of the Montgomery March and Bloody Sunday, President Johnson had really vowed not to expand voting rights. But because of the power of the movement and people pushing and saying it has to be so, the Voting Rights Act was passed. Now what we have to do now is make sure that we restore all of its protections and expand. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a constant struggle. It surely is, but I don't want us to lose hope, because this is how change is made. It's when people make up their minds and get together with people that are like them and nothing like them, and build broad and deep kind of coalitions of folk, and push forward what is absolutely necessary for the thriving and surviving of our people. That change does happen. It really does, and it can happen. And so I just want to say it doesn't make it easy. It doesn't make it popular. But again, as Christians, we follow someone that was not popular, at least in the eyes of those in power. And it's our duty, I think, to try to live into what God intends, not what necessarily our politicians intend. And so it then gets us to this question of right now we do not have a conversation about military spending happening at all in our society. And folks, so again, there are people that I know that would say we shouldn't have any military budget, but that's actually not the conversation we're having here. We're talking about what does it look like to shift some of the military spending towards the kind of programs that would actually make our society and our world safer. We're talking about what will it take to actually come up against continued war and continued fighting and conflict, because war does not benefit many people. I remember I had a sign growing up a poster in my basement, which is our playroom, and it was said, "War is not healthy for children and other living things," right? And that's still true. And so I think what we're talking about here isn't that this is simple or easy, or we're saying we're never going to have any money for or we don't support our troops, or we don't support intervention. But I think what we are talking about is, can we have a conversation, and can we connect in our movements for racial equality, for economic equality, for saving the planet? Can we also talk about the problem of military spending and of the militarization of our world and our communities, and how we're going to be able to live lives to the fullest, because having that conversation is one that would get us a lot closer to building this kind of beloved community that folk are thinking about. But when we don't even take off, like when we won't even talk about this problem of militarism and military spending, I think we really do run the risk then of approaching the spiritual death that Dr. King, really warned about.
So we only have a few minutes left, doggone it, and there are so many wonderful intersectional issues, questions emerging in the Q&A. Folks are asking about, what's happening right now at the southern border and the militarization of our borders, the militarization of our immigration process. Somebody has commented that our theology seems to be militarism, and so it sounds like folks are also recognizing we need a rework of our theology. Jimmy, somebody's asked if there's a prototype for the global mission plan, if there's something already written. You suggested that. Another person is talking about the importance of centering imprisoned people in this conversation about poverty and militarism, since we have for-profit prisons and we have that complex going on. We have somebody reminding us, Bill Galvin reminds us that there are actually requirements to register, even though we don't have an active draft, there are still requirements for males to register. And if they don't They may have trouble getting financial aid or getting a driver's license. So that is still in place. Folks are talking about militarism starting in our schools, and bullying and the role of the ROTC as a good or bad thing. And so you have awakened a lot of interest in this topic of militarism and our economy. And for that, I give you thanks. Could each of you very briefly, because I think we have like 2 minutes, so 1 minute each, is there one thing you'd like to leave us with today? Jimmy, you want to start?
Yeah, and again, I think this has been indicative of the conversation, is that we are people of faith, and we are called to affirm the values of our faith. And as it has been said, oftentimes that will make you very unpopular, but there are ways in which we can impact this country and this world in a very positive way. And I do think that one of the uniqueness of being a person of faith is that you do have guidance. You know, we read scripture for guidance, and we read the teaching, especially focus on the gospels, and learning about the personality and teachings of Jesus. And so I do think the promotion of Christian values within the context of not necessarily to convert people to Christianity, but to have people to look at life differently, to have a different attitude about what it means to be great and to be powerful. And we are basically people who value love and value other human beings. That all people are created in the image and likeness of God. And I will say, closing with this, I do hope that as we talk about militarism and many of these issues, we do it from a global perspective. And not oftentimes we do get caught up in what's happening in the USA, but oftentimes we're just a minuscule reflection of the militarism that's being promoted around the world. So I do want us to have a global perspective as well.
So I think I just want to kind of make an invitation for anyone here that is not already involved in the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival. We have coordinating committees made up of moral leaders and clergy, advocates, activists, and poor and low-income folk in dozens of states across the country. And you can check out poorpeoplescampaign.org to get involved. I mean, one of the injustices and interlocking injustices that we spend a lot of time and attention on, including taking action around, is this problem of militarism and its connection to racism and poverty. And then, you know, I direct the Cairo Center, and we're trying to do some of that theological work for peace and beloved community. We have a worshiping 1001 new worshiping community of the Presbyterian Church that meets every Sunday evening. You're welcome to join us. It's at 6 p.m. Eastern time. We send out a lot of analysis and other information. And so, you know, part of this is about kind of trying to really build the kind of movement, not just one program or policy that's gonna, you know, kind of turn our war economy into a peace economy and build this kind of beloved community. So please, if you're able and willing, check us out and connect with us, and let's work more closely together.
Wonderful. Well, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris and Reverend Jimmy Hawkins, thank you both for taking time to be with us. 90 minutes goes very quickly. I know 60 minutes is just not enough for these conversations. So our Connecting the Dots webinars are 90 minutes in length. The Militarism Working Group has 2 or 3 more that we are envisioning and will be offering in the coming months. So stay tuned for those. And we're really grateful to each of you who has joined us today, and wish you God's peace as we conclude our time together. Peace be with all of you.